Now we have, on the back of the greatest comeback story, political comeback story in American history, we have Trump, who is completely unconstrained and is completely convinced, confident that everything he's doing is utterly right, doesn't need to take advice from those around him.
Ian Bremmer, welcome back to the show.
Preet, I've missed you so.
Likewise, I'm sure. We weren't going to have you on this quickly because you come on a lot.
More than most.
You are more than all. And I have been noting, both in your private texts to me, which I will not share with the public, and also in your public pronouncements on social media, your tone has gotten a little bit less familiar to me and more anxious. Tell me if that's the right word. More concerned.
Concerned.
And you're the risk assessment guy. And I wouldn't say you're a canary in the coal mine necessarily, but it's a metric. It's a data point for me. Let me read back to you a couple of things that you said recently. This was just a few days ago. You wrote on the X, the United States, the world's most powerful country, has become the most dysfunctional, kleptocratic, and unfree political system of the advanced industrial democracies by far. How quickly did you come to that conclusion after January 20?
I've actually said similar things before January 20th. They just weren't taken as alarming.
Why is that?
Because then you think of it as more structural as opposed to more driven by the guy that's running the country, right? Because there are two reasons that the U.S. is in this position. One is that for decades, the U.S. has become more kleptocratic. Its system has become more captured. Its people increasingly don't believe in it. That is not a function of Trump. That's a function of long-standing trends in the U.S. that we do not have in Canada or in Germany or Japan.
Can you define what you mean by kleptocratic for folks?
Sure. I mean coin-operated. I mean that the U.S. system responds differently to people that give a lot of money to their favored political causes than it does to people that don't. It is a very much two-track system in that regard, in a way that other advanced industrial democracies are to a far lesser degree. So that's not new.
But the reason that you stated it in that particularly stark way, am I right? It's because of how things have unfolded under Trump in the last 11 weeks?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I mean, how kleptocratic were we under Biden?
And yet we were. I mean, there were more billionaires that gave money to Biden and Kamala in the run in 2024 than actually gave to Trump. So, I mean, it's not like these guys were somehow a relief from that, but certainly Trump's willingness to enrich himself and his family on the back of directly being in a position of power is now pushing the boundaries beyond anything we've seen before. Elon's conflict of interests that exist in being the most powerful person outside of Trump, but also running 6 private sector major multinationals at the same time, and being completely unclear whether he is representing an official view of the U.S. or his private business when he's meeting with heads of state and CEOs. I mean, these are all unprecedented things. But also, Preet, since we're focusing on the anxious side, just yesterday, I also pushed back on the Financial Times, which has been having a day over the last weeks about how the U.S. is now halfway to being a police state. And I'm like, that's absolutely not true.
How far are we?
Well, the U.S. is not anywhere close to being the most free dictatorship. It is by far the most unfree democracy, advanced democracy, and those are two very different things. And the FT was
sounds like we're
conflating
dancing
them.
on the head of
We're
a
not.
pin.
We're not. We're not.
Hold on. But the thing you just said,
Yes.
maybe it's different from the other thing that other people said, the FT said. But what you just said, can you just repeat what you just said about being the most unfree democracy? That's a pretty alarming and startling thing, is it not?
Most unfree advanced industrial democracy. There are democracies that are more unfree. I would say El Salvador is a democracy that is much more unfree.
When you talk about the most unfree advanced democracy, how many countries in the denominator there?
Well, the important ones would be the other G7 because
Right. So
those are
that's
the
at least
large
six.
ones. Yeah, that's six. But then
Okay.
you've also got a whole bunch of, you got New Zealand and
So like
Australia,
15, 18?
probably let's say 25 or 30,
Right. And
right?
by
I mean,
your reckoning,
yeah.
the United States of America is the least free of those advanced democracies. And how long has that been so in your mind?
That's probably been so for at least 10 years, but it is now dramatically so. It was not as clearly so when I first started saying it.
Can I push back for a moment?
Sure.
So on the issue of speech,
Yeah.
where do you think the United States ranks among that group? Don't we have the most free speech, notwithstanding incursions into that right or onto that right? Most countries don't have a First Amendment.
I agree. And indeed, that is one component of freedom and liberty that you would, even in the last 10 years, put generally on the American side of the ledger.
So are we not free?
I mean, more recently, of course, even in freedom of speech, the US has had a very chilling effect, as you've seen in the push against universities for needing to vet students on the basis of views on anti-Semitism, for example, and the numbers of students holding green cards that have been rounded up and deported on the basis of what they are and are not saying. And these are not people that have been tried with crimes. Unfree in terms of using a legal system to engage in suits that now big media organizations like ABC News and others are saying we'd much rather settle. We don't want to fight that. We're not going to stand up for our freedom of speech because it's just not worth getting in trouble with a president. And right. I mean, and so many examples like that. Look at what's happened at the Washington Post or the LA Times that are just feeling like it's not worth trying to run a broad political sample of op-eds because you're going to end up only undermining your business. So, I mean, there are lots of ways I think that freedom of speech have been constrained in the United States of late.
We still got a very robust right to bear arms. Does that count?
Yeah. I like the way you smile a little bit when you ask that. Is the ability for lots of people to buy, I mean, more guns per capita than any country in the world except Yemen. I don't consider Yemen to be high on the freedom scale.
They're not in the denominator that we were just talking about.
No, Yemen probably doesn't make advanced industrial democracy status at this point. I think that is a fair cop.
So I want to talk about the economy and I want to talk about the tariff topsy-turviness. But before we get into that generally, just related to what we're talking about, kleptocracy and pay to play. So what we've seen, and I guess it was foreseeable that, Donald Trump announces broad-based tariffs. Everyone gets a tariff. Here's a tariff for you. Here's a tariff for you. More for China. And then the world freaks out legitimately and predictably. And now one by one, we're talking about exemptions. Well, the iPhone, we got to exempt that. Or, certain other things we got to exempt. How does that play into your theory of kleptocracy or lack of freedom? Or is that a good thing that we can moderate a horrendous and devastating and debilitating tariff policy, even if it's so by individual companies getting their own private exemptions?
It's a different thing, Preet. I mean, the fact that the United States has a political system that is increasingly untrusted and is seen by its own population as, for various reasons, illegitimate, and they disagree on why it's illegitimate and who's responsible for the lack of legitimacy, but they generally agree on that. That's why you got Trump, and Trump is a principal beneficiary of that underlying reality. In fact, most Americans that voted in 2024 that thought that democracy was a significant reason to vote actually voted for Trump and not for Harris. So these are people that thought that the U.S. was already so broken that they wanted someone that was going to come in and just like destroy stuff. And they believe that the only way you can fix it is through extra legal means, which is a big, that is a red flashing lights warning signal. Now, the tariff issue is a very different sort of challenge. It is the United States today as the most powerful country, as the strongest economy, also driving the lion's share of geopolitical and geoeconomic uncertainty on the global stage. No one is doing more to disrupt and to create volatility than the U.S. today. And first, with these impositions of the highest sanctions you've seen on the world in well over 100 years on everybody, and with very little underlying logical justification for the kinds of tariffs that were the equation behind the tariffs that were actually implemented across the board. So very hard for others, whether you're investing in the markets, you're doing business, or you're on the receiving end as another country, trying to figure out why it was that this is being done and how should you respond and what is the end game for the Trump administration. Makes it really hard. And then you're right, then responding very, very quickly to all sorts of pressure, domestic and international, to suspend. I wouldn't say take off because it's unclear whether or not the suspensions are going to last for any period of time. But it certainly suspend big pieces of the tariffs that have been put in place. But even the tariffs that remain as of today still bring us directly back to the 1930s in terms of tariff levels. So, I mean, there's no reason to be comforted, even on the back, even if there were no further snapback of sanctions going forward, and this was it, you would still say, wow, this was massively destructive to globalization.
My question again, is it a good thing or a bad thing that particular companies like Apple can say, take us off the list, even if temporarily?
It's good for the markets. It's good for Apple. It's bad for people that don't have the access like Apple. I mean, small and medium enterprises cannot do that, right? And America needs small and medium enterprises, and that's sort of how America has built itself up. That's how you create a robust middle class and an upper class that is actually something that people can aspire to. And everybody is not Steve Jobs, right?
Right. So how does it help? This is the confusion that I talk about and think about all the time, and different people have different answers for it. If you're a MAGA Trump supporter and you trust him to engage in this broad-based tariff policy to bring back manufacturing jobs, which no one seems to actually really want, and you think, well, at least we can have iPhones being built in this country. And then he engages in these exemptions one by one, either on a whim or because of people's political power or political contribution power. What do you say to that MAGA voter who is trusting Trump to engage in a very aggressive, some would say outlandish, but he would say long term, long horizon strategy, bring manufacturing jobs back? What do you say to that person?
Well, then you'd want a strategy that you can execute on. You'd want a strategy that will work. And that is, of course, not what we've seen from the Trump administration. Now, he has implemented strategies that will work on other things that people want, like, for example, getting rid of illegal immigrants and closing the border. So if that is an outcome that you want, and a lot of Americans do, I would say the Trump efforts so far on many issues have been consistent, strategic, and are likely to lead to the intended outcome. On trade and on reshoring, they are not consistent efforts. They are not going to lead to the preferred outcome. They are certainly going to hurt an immense number of Trump voters to get from here to there. And the promised land is not on the horizon. So that's very, very different on those two fundamental issues for why people came out and voted for Trump.
Can we talk about a word that's oft used and maybe not fully understood. And I'll admit that I don't fully understand the term globalization, which is kind of a bad word in Trump circles. You have written, you're not the only one, that whatever we mean by globalization, I'm going to ask you to define it, is one of the sources of America's outsized wealth over the last number of decades. What is globalization? What do people mean when they talk about it? How much is Trump's tariff policy understood as anti-globalization? And to the extent that globalization is the thing that made us prosperous, is that the reason why the tariff policy is pure folly or something else?
I think of globalization as a system that was driven by the United States with the support of all of its allies that allowed us to move goods and services and people and capital more easily, faster and faster across borders all over the world. And that improved efficiency, it improved productivity, it grew a massive global middle class that had not existed historically. It also massively enriched a small number, but a significant number of really rich people in the advanced industrial economies, particularly the US, but also American allies. Now, we all know that as a consequence of that, there were large numbers of people in the US and in the West that did not directly benefit, that lost jobs, lost investment. And that is a reality of the fact that they were comparatively expensive for the work that they were doing. And you could produce a lot of those things much more cheaply outside the United States. But the profits were being brought to the United States and they were not distributed to those people. The shareholders and the government that was captured by the shareholders were not ensuring that the social contract in the United States was made good for a couple of generations of Americans, especially aspirational working and middle class men. And especially in rural areas, especially in second tier cities, especially without university educations. And these are people that are now voting for Trump in overwhelmingly strong numbers. And they're doing so not just among white people, but among Hispanics too, and even among significant Black population. So, I mean, that is telling you that the government response to globalization was really inadequate for a lot of Americans. Now, the country as a whole did incredibly well. So the idea that the US has been screwed or victimized or taken advantage of or ripped off or whatever your term of art is that Trump and others are using by all of these other countries around the world. Well, first of all, the United States is by far the richest large economy. So how do these poor countries manage to all screw us? And oh, woe is us, the United States, where all the big corporations are, right? Where all the big banks are, where we have the reserve currency. We're the ones that make the decisions on how to invest. How are we screwed by all these other countries? Number one. And number two, like Trump said that, well, we're screwed wherever we're running a trade deficit. And there are lots of countries that are running trade surpluses against us. Well, first of all, there are a lot of those countries that are running trade surpluses are so poor that they can't afford any American goods. So that's why they're running trade surpluses. And the idea that we are getting screwed by them is insane, like on its face. And we need to say that all of these countries like Bangladesh and all the sub-Saharan African countries and the poorest countries in South America know. And secondly, even the countries where America was running and is running a trade surplus. So on its face, by Trump's own formulation, we are taking advantage of them. We are screwing them. That's working because we're running a trade surplus. He puts 10% tariffs on them anyway.
We
Why?
don't care about them. We don't have
Because
to
he can. Because he can. So, I mean, this was in my view, one of the stupidest at-scale policies I have ever seen implemented. I mean, like even in the context of America's war against Saddam Hussein, right? This scene on the back of 9/11, right, which Iraq had literally nothing to do with. This seems pretty stupid, even in the context of that.
You know what's interesting to me?
I don't treat. Sometimes I do, but in this case, I don't.
Not that you
actually
care, but
No, I do care. I
it's my
frequently
show.
care, but because it's your
I
show, I feel like
frequently
it's not
care.
going to be something I care about.
From time to time, you care.
Yeah.
Well, that's good. You're a
Sometimes,
good
yeah.
friend.
No, when it's personal, I always care.
Thanks, Ian.
That's true.
And this is a bit of my, armchair psychology that may or may not be stupid. Probably it's stupid, but I've speculated about how the one reason in sort of internal makeup and psychology of Donald Trump that he doesn't care about allies and doesn't see worth in allies is he doesn't have friends, and he's not seeing good, an important worth in loyalty to friends other than in one direction, only to him.
And that's why you and I care so much about allies, for example. Is that where you were going with this? Because then I care. If you're saying that, I care all of a sudden.
It wasn't, but in parallel, and tell me
That's
if you
too
think
bad.
this is also silly.
Yeah. I didn't think that was silly. I don't know if it's true.
Trump has ridden to victory in the White House 2 times, even though he's an incredibly successful American business person, and you can quibble about his bankruptcies and everything else, but he's incredibly successful. He won the White House twice. The second time he won the Senate and won the House, and yet he's propelled himself based on a story of victimhood that everyone buys into. And I was reminded of that thinking when you were talking a moment ago about how, in sort of parallel fashion, he's convinced a lot of people, and certainly himself, that the most prosperous nation the world has ever seen was in fact a victim and is always being ripped off. And how powerful a political argument it is to convince people who are very lucky, who are very fortunate, who are very well endowed with riches and resources and privileges and rights, that they are being screwed and they're the victim. Is that odd to you?
I'll open up on a personal bias here. And something in my job and your job, it's so important for us to try to be aware of where we have personal biases. I have always fundamentally mistrusted people that come from extraordinary privilege and act like they don't. I don't like hiring people like that. I tend to think they're lazy. I tend to mistrust their values. I understand that as a bias. It is unfair for me to bring that to a conversation with someone, but as someone who grew up from the projects and was and had nothing handed to me. I had an amazing mother, but I mean, I had no financial well-being, no connections, no network. And I saw all these kids in school and university, and they're showing up in their little BMWs, and they think they're all that, and they're not working, and they think that it's just their due, and frequently they can be so thin-skinned, and so I've always found Trump very unappealing in that way. That this is a guy who got everything from his dad.
Right, unappealing to you.
Unappealing to me.
I mean, it's a sort of gaslighting. Like, here you take the most powerful person on earth, the most famous person on earth, the most talked about person on earth, one of the richer people around, but he's the victim. How does that play? Like, how does he cause people to identify with him who are very, very, very different and who are, in fact, victims of structural inequalities in our system?
First of all, he has political instincts that are pretty extraordinary. He doesn't really care about substance of policy, but in terms of reading a situation and smelling weakness, sensing opportunity, and willing without any filter, any thought, just animal lizard brain instinct, jumping in and doing it. And you see that in the way he acts constantly with people and on the stage. He's also very charismatic. He's very confident and sure of himself. He's also quite tall and large, which helps in this environment. It's how, go look at CEOs in America and look how tall and large they are, right? And I think that those things all play very well for him. Also, I look back on his first G20 meeting as president in Hamburg with all the leaders, and I look back on when a whole bunch of them were sniggering, about him. I look back on the White House Correspondents' Dinner when he was sitting there and Obama laughed at him. And, he has always not just had a chip on his shoulder in being around establishment elites, but also has never been treated as one of them. has been, he's brash, he's unpolished.
Banks would not, what people forget,
Yeah.
and
Banks wouldn't
people
bank
remind
him.
me, banks wouldn't bank him.
Yeah.
Consider
Deutsche Bank said no. I remember that whole thing. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
banks wouldn't bank him. A lot of law firms wouldn't work with him.
Yeah.
Which probably is why he derives some sadistic
Sadistic,
pleasure.
so you mean to say, yeah.
I know. I get my S&M confused from time to time.
I know that about you, actually, Preet. It's made for some interesting evenings.
There you go. We're going to have to cut that part.
Really? Why?
Yeah, because it's a family show.
That's too bad.
And I don't want to look ignorant about such important things in
sometimes
American life.
S&M. I don't think that we don't need to somehow disparage, alternative lifestyles on this podcast.
Can I ask you to do a more substantive thought experiment with me?
Sure.
What is the right way? So you're God for a moment, right? And you're trying to, for the purposes of this experiment.
Okay.
Or at least you're Adam Smith.
Okay.
Right. You're like a modern version, a more enlightened and modern and cosmopolitan version of Adam Smith.
Yeah.
And you're trying to design from behind this, political theory conceit, the veil of ignorance. You don't know what, after the construction of an economic system for the world, you don't know if you're going to be in America. You don't know if you're going to be in the UK. You don't know if you're going to be in Belize or in El Salvador, or wherever you're going to be.
Or India. Yeah.
Pretty substantial likelihood of being in the United States.
Yeah.
And you're trying to construct a free market system that lifts all boats, that allows individual nations to maintain their sovereignty and their borders and their national security, but the ability to make goods and products and offer services is done efficiently, so that the citizens of all these nations benefit. So if you are in a country that is blessed with the good weather to grow coffee beans, naturally your ordered system will lend itself to that exploitation of that resource. If you have great universities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, what would that system look like in terms of tariffs and restrictions and the way we have seen globalization arise, and how different would it look from what we have today?
I think it would have a tariff system that was very similar to what we had pre-second term Trump. It would have very, very low barriers to entry to markets. It would have very, very low tariffs. And it would also have relatively light touch regulation, because a European system, which has very strong performance for its citizens in social contract and for labor, does not support growth, doesn't support productivity, and helping your population when over decades you can't actually bring the benefits of that system to those people is not a system that you want to emulate. You know that today we think of Europe as rich, and yet the average European does not have the economic well-being of Mississippi. And Mississippi is like the poorest state in America, and it's actually people in Mississippi on average wealthier than Europe, the average European. That is like a pretty significant hole they have to dig out from. They're obviously not producing for their people. So, but you do need to take away the ability of American political actors to be captured by special interests. I mean, so the US system runs so much better in creating macro outcomes than any other major system, certainly wealthy system, but it just doesn't distribute. And so you have to ensure that, look, what we need is more capitalism, Preet. Honestly, we need more capitalism. And in the United States, we don't have enough capitalism. What we have are really, really wealthy people and corporations that are incredibly capitalist when they talk about their own gains, and they become socialists when they talk about losses that come because of them. They aren't willing to pay for negative externalities. We need a system that forces corporations and special interests to pay for the negative externalities that come as a consequence of their profit, whether it is the pollution that comes from the business that they the resources they exploit, or whether it is the the carbon and in the atmosphere that comes from that, the productivity that they benefit from, whether it's the water that they take as a free resource from the country. I mean, all of those things create negative externalities for citizens, and the views of most companies are, well, that's not my issue. That's just like a tax for everybody, or that's something that like our kids should pay for. That's where the United States short-termism baked into the American system, anti-capitalist, is a serious problem.
You don't mean by more capitalism, less safety net, right?
No, no. I think that real capitalism is not just focused on profits. It's also focused on losses. And you can't have a system where you get to control the rules to ensure that no one recognizes your losses as your losses. The United States does not have a capitalist system, is one where the government acts as an independent regulator, right? And we don't have that in the US.
Does more capitalism mean less subsidy for private enterprise by the government?
Yeah, I think that there are probably strategic industries that would not get enough of a lift fast enough from being able to raise capital through traditional private sector means, that it's good for the government to put its foot on the scale there. There are also places where there are public goods that we agree that matter for a properly functioning civil society, that just doesn't make enough money for a company to want to go in. So, for example, I believe that people in rural areas should have news. And if there isn't a private sector market for that, I think that's something that tax dollars should be spent on doing. I don't think it should be politicized.
You think government dollars should be spent on independent journalism? How long does that stay independent?
I mean, I think, for example, when I say news, I mean, I'm not talking about covering politics. I'm talking about like weather, right? I think like people in rural areas should have weather reports and forecasts. And if there's not enough of a market to provide that, the US government and other governments should provide that for them. I believe that. I think there are things like that. But in general, I think subsidies are way too high and way too inefficient.
This is not this, but when you were speaking, it reminded me of the issue. How bad is it that we basically shut down Voice of America around the world?
It's horrible. Horrible.
Why?
I mean, as someone who used to listen to Voice of America when I was traveling in East Bloc countries and talked to so many people that got their news from that, and I recognize it's not as urgent today as it used to be. But I mean, VOA is not a Soros-supported leftist cabal that is, trying to promote wokeism. Voice of America was actually standing for the values that got America late, but ultimately into World War II. Voice of America is standing for the values that brought the wall down, that allowed people that were living under authoritarian regimes to aspire to personal liberty and to free speech.
So why should it? Why should Ian? Some things I understand why Trump does, even as I disagree with him. Some things I understand less. What explains this?
I think when you look at USAID and you look at the State Department, these are agencies that are staffed by effete intellectuals, educated in a lot of the universities that Trump is now going after.
I mean, in the perception of some people.
Yeah, but also, I mean, there's some reality to that too. I don't deny it. I think that there was a sort of a surfeit of DEI and wokeism in these places that I don't think served the country, frankly, well, and served the kids going through those systems well. I agree with that. As someone who went to Tulane, which was very much not that, for example. But I also think that USAID specifically was like a hotbed of progressivism inside state. And there were a lot of programs in there that if the average taxpayer was aware that's where their money was going, 95% of them would say, what the hell is this? But that was not 50%, 70%, 80% of the money that was being spent. Most of the money that was being spent was on basic humanitarian aid, was on helping to prevent disease, things that actually really matter, that reduce forced migration, including to the United States, that actually help us maintain our borders, that reduce the spread of infectious disease, that doesn't care about our border security, right? I mean, those are things that like anyone should want. And Trump and Elon decided to kill. And I completely oppose that. I think it's super important to oppose that. I like the fact that the United States, look, America first would work if it was America long-term first, if it was America strategically and thoughtfully first. But it's not. It's not. It's really like America, like right now, I want it right now. It has to happen right now first. And by the way, it's really about me, Trump, and people close to me.
Although,
Yes.
as stupid and as idiotic and as consequential and as frenetic and as lopsided the tariff policy has been, on that point,
Yes.
Trump is not talking about immediately America first. He's talking about a period of pain. You take your medicine, whether that's injecting bleach or something else into the economy, to use that metaphor.
Mm-hmm.
So all that you've said about, I mean, that's what the analysis that I have engaged in and others have engaged in for a long time, what you just said. But on this issue of bringing manufacturing jobs back, which is asinine given the way he's going about doing it, at least you can't say this is a policy that is only recently something that's of interest to Trump. It's been of interest to him and a core belief for 40 years. And it's a long-term strategic play, as dumb as we might think it is. Fair?
Look, I think that the United States deciding to allow semiconductors as an industry to wholesale leave the United States and go to Taiwan, 100 miles off of the People's Republic of China, over the last 25, 30 years was an enormous mistake. It was short-sighted.
Right, but I just want to get you to concede.
I'm getting there. So
Yeah.
I thought that was, so for example, Trump deciding that no, we're going to tariff Taiwan and we actually want that industry in the United States because it's strategically important. I fully support that. Now, why in God's name would you at the same time say you're killing the CHIPS Act? I don't understand that. I think it was absolutely right for Trump in the first term to strongly pressure Germany and the Europeans against Nord Stream and their short-term smart, long-term strategically stupid decision to get so much of their energy from Russia. Same thing. They shouldn't have done that. It should have been from the Middle East, should have been from the US. Now, why Trump is now trying to cut a deal with the Russians over the heads of the Europeans is completely, sort of flies in the face of what he was trying to do in his first term. So again, the execution is so poor and inconsistent on these issues, as opposed to on migration, where I completely see and understand and support a lot of what he's doing. That it's just very hard to give him credit for saying some long-term stuff about manufacturing in the U.S. when none of the policies are really oriented towards doing that effectively.
So what's going to happen and how much of this change is permanent? I'll point out another post that you put up in the last day or two. The Trump administration is more politically aligned with El Salvador than Canada and the European Union. This is challenging for a lot of world leaders to accept. Should they be surprised? We had a first go for 4 years.
Yeah, so different. So different. Because, of course, in the first go, Trump was constrained, very seriously constrained on his economic team, on his national security team, by his vice president, by so many people that would just say, no, Mr. President, we can't do that. Or sometimes they wouldn't even say it. They just like go ahead and do things. Right, exactly. Which is not the way, by the way, which is, clearly not the way you want to run a government.
Unless Donald Trump is the president.
Now we have, on the back of the greatest comeback story, political comeback story in American history, we have Trump who is completely unconstrained and is completely convinced, confident that everything he's doing is utterly right, doesn't need to take advice from those around him.
So the question is, so what are European erstwhile allies going to do that will prevent a return to the normal order if you get a more sane president of the other party in place in 4 years?
Yeah, I think that there is already in 3 months, and we've got 4 years, of this administration. In 3 months, there has already been permanent damage done to the transatlantic relationship. It will not be put together again. Sometimes, you have a relationship with somebody, whoever it is, and they do something and you go, I can't unsee that. Right? That is what has now happened between the United States and Europe. It did not happen in his first term.
Right. And as part of the reason for that, they have now seen that there's no inevitability to sanity in American politics. And so that even if a person who's more global and in sync with the aesthetic and the philosophy and believes in the allyship, et cetera, that 4 years later we could have another Trump because America's proven that it's capable of doing that. Is that what it is?
It would be nice if that was the reason. And I think that certainly that conversation is being had among heads of state in Europe. But actually, the real reason is that in just 3 months, the Americans have turned into a direct and threatening adversary of things that are core to Europe. And this is going to happen for 4 years. And there is no way you live through that without taking steps to protect yourself that are permanent, irrespective of what the next president is going to look like.
But will Trump say, and his supporters say in a few years, well, that means that the Europeans are spending more on their own defense. They're becoming more self-sufficient. They're becoming, Europe first or individual countries first. And that's great. That's how it should be. Or will they come to rue the day?
Well, of course, publicly, they will only say positive things. So whether or not some will recognize this was a big mistake is going to depend on how the Americans are performing. The reality is that the Europeans will end up doing a lot more business in other parts of the world. The reality is the Europeans will send their kids to other universities. They will travel less to the United States. They will work less with the Americans. So yes, I absolutely support the Europeans finally spending more on defense, but it is not just about that. This is long-term reputational capital that the United States has had and built up over decades and decades, which we are incinerating. And I think that is, so going back to, do I feel more concerned right now? Yes. I consider myself a patriot. This country has given me a lot. It's given me everything, every opportunity I have. And it pains me to see that young people are not going to have those opportunities because of things we are doing to ourselves. That does concern me. It bothers me as a person.
Is there
I wear
anything
that on my sleeve a little. I'm old enough. I've done this long enough that I'm just going to be. I'm honest with people, right? Like I don't have anything to be apologized for.
Look, I'm with you. I have a lot of the same feelings. You and I are very good friends off camera and outside the podcast, and we talk about these things.
Yeah,
frequently over a beverage, which is how these things often need to be discussed. Is there anything that could happen, whether it's the loss of confidence among independents, which looks like it's happening? Probably wouldn't be the loss of confidence among the MAGA faithful, because that seems to never happen, or the midterms swaying to the Democrats, or some other national crisis. Is there anything you can see that might halt the progress of this insanity that you've been describing? Not in 4 years, but before that?
I'll answer that question. And I think that there are some things, but let's also recognize that you have to ask the question of, is there anything really fucking horrible that could also happen as a result of all of this damage that people aren't thinking about?
I was trying to be positive, Ian.
That could make it much, much worse than you actually expect. Both are possible. So what the thing that is most likely to constrain Trump, in my view, is not the Supreme Court. It's not a constitutional crisis and the system holds. It's rather that he's picking fights simultaneously with some very powerful actors that are capable of saying no and beating him up and undermining his position. And we see that globally with China. He did not expect the Chinese were going to hit him in the face back hard. And that's exactly what they're doing. And it is undermining him. And Xi Jinping is going out to the Europeans and going to the Southeast Asians that let's work together against this horrible guy, Trump. And now Trump's saying, well, I might need, countries to make a choice between the US and China. Well, a lot of those countries are going to make a choice, not the United States. So I think that the fact that Trump has picked a really big fight against an actor that is capable of waiting him out politically, even though they're going to take a lot of economic pain, is a kind of could end up being a come to Jesus for Trump that forces him to lose a lot of face. And that forcing him, and he is, Trump is today, in my view, Trump is in a weaker global position than he was the day before Liberation Day because of his own goals. He now has less influence with other countries that he wants to convince to do the things he wants them to do. When he was pushing around Panama and Denmark and Canada, now he's pushing around everyone. And some of those folks are coming back and saying, screw you.
Yeah, because the laws of physics ultimately
apply.
And it may take some time for the forces to array or get organized. Now, I ask you another question since we're running out of time. Forget about outside the United States. I think I know your answer to this, and I know my answer to this, and I've talked about it on the podcast many times. What is the need or necessity and likelihood of domestic institutions to say F you and fight back, like some law firms, not all, and like Harvard University just has?
That's right.
How
That's right.
What's your
That's
message to domestic? Tell me. Forget about
going.
China for a moment. What about American institutions?
I mean, China and Harvard, right? I mean, that's actually
some people put those together.
Well, yeah. I mean, at this point, Harvard might as well establish a big campus in China. You could just kind of align the whole thing. The reality is that Harvard, it is a university with a larger endowment than any other, and a lot of really powerful people that have given them a lot of money, that care, that are alums. And yes, they are vulnerable because of their wokeism, but ultimately, I suspect Harvard is stronger than they are vulnerable. And it's not clear to me that Trump really wants that fight, full on that fight.
They also have you point out, I keep hearing reports that the Trump folks themselves realize they don't have 4 years. You keep talking about 4, they don't have 4 years. They have like 12 to 18 months, particularly because the midterms might be.
I hope that's right.
Disastrous for him.
I'm not sure it's
because the forces array, and it just sort of, and an action taken in year 4, even if it's a lawsuit against, an executive order against a law firm, you can kind of wait it out.
Depends on what the legal system in the U.S. looks like at that point.
True.
Depends on how much control. I mean, if the U.S. looks more like Hungary or Turkey, then I'm sorry, you don't have a lame duck period, right? And that's we got to understand those are the stakes we are talking about here, right?
Are you chagrined? Because I am. At how many institutions are just sort of accommodating him? Or are you a pragmatic guy? You're like, look, if you can accommodate without too much harm to your self-image and to your bottom line and to your mission, you do it.
No,
I don't have that view.
I'm more chagrined, but I also try to put myself in the position of those people as opposed to just being publicly critical, because it is very easy for you and I, Preet, having the history and the backgrounds that we do, like we have put ourselves in a position where we can say what we want. And, our reputation is intact. Our career is intact. We've got our books, we've got our, we've got our baseline money and our business and everything else. Like, that's it. If you are working for someone in an institution where you're taking a lot of money from the government, or they have a lot of direct leverage over you, or you could be fired at any moment, it is a lot harder to be out there publicly saying the things that you and I are saying. So first of all, I feel like I have a greater obligation to be in the position that I am because I'm in the position that I am. And I think that I am glad that Harvard decided to go. Look, I've been talking to Larry Summers a lot over the last few months. And
help us get him on the show, because I'd like to talk to him.
Sure. He just came on mine last week, and it was, I'm happy to, because he knows, he should know that I like you a lot. It'd be good for you to have him. He's been out there using his influence, a lot of it, to try to make sure that Harvard did the right thing here. right? And it's a lot easier for Harvard than it is for my own Columbia, where I teach, for my amusement. And so, I guess I'm saying I would like American CEOs to band together and be more public. I mean, even Jamie Dimon, who has done more than most, has been very cautious in my view. I mean, he seems very stage managed.
But some people will credit what he said most recently with being one of the prompts
Yes,
for Trump to pause the tariffs.
that's right. And that's why I'm saying that, like, I'm reluctant to just come out and criticize Jamie, given both the fact that I know he's actually had a positive impact here, and also because he's just in a radically different position than I am. There are potentially really negative consequences for Jamie and for the people at JP Morgan if he decides to say what he actually thinks publicly. And for me, frankly, maybe there are some, but I mean, frankly, I actually think, short of the worst outcomes in the United States, it's actually, I've aligned myself so that it's good for me to be authentic with people, because I'm just not comfortable otherwise. I can't live otherwise.
Yeah. I mean, the problem with a lot of the things, I mean, many problems, things the Trump administration is doing is among them the completely asymmetrical use of force, completely disproportionate application of retribution. So, for example, going after a law firm because for 5 minutes they employed somebody who Trump didn't like. Meanwhile, the 1,000 people who work there now had nothing to do with any of those things.
And they're getting hurt. Yep. Doesn't care.
It's such an overreach that it's hard to know how to deal with it. And
it's like the South Salvadoran guy, which, I mean,
Yeah.
like, I'm sure, you've had conversations about, right?
oh, many. Yeah, we talk about it on the podcast all the time.
It's like, the woman, the students in Boston, and the one in Columbia. And I mean, these are all, like, the cruelty is so frequently the point. I mean, one of our principal algorithmic exports at this point, on X, is a site that Elon frequently engages with, called I Find Retards, right? And I really find it unfortunate that that's something that my president and his advisors and cabinet and top supporters think that that's a good thing for us to export. I really have a problem with that.
Do you think there is a full heir to Donald Trump? Or does Trumpism essentially subside? This form of aggressive Trumpism and retribution and everything else, and transfixed loyalty on the part of 35% of the public, does that go away when Trump goes away?
I mean, look, Elon doesn't even have a position, and look at what he's been able to do. I think that if Trump is still in good health, and if he is able to anoint a successor, JD or someone else, that the impact that Trump will personally have in a next administration has the potential to be unprecedentedly large. I'm not someone that believes he's trying to run for a third term, but I don't think that Trump, I mean, I would.
There's a lot that we haven't predicted. I mean, did you predict this tariff policy?
Not at this level, but we certainly, if you go back and look at our top risks from January that you and I talked about back then, and I do that every month pretty much, I've been pretty stunned with how spot on a piece that a lot of people thought we were being alarmist at that point has proven to be. And it's truly, like, you remember the G0 wins, that the idea that the U.S. is going to not just abdicate, but actively try to burn down its own system, undo its own system, and instead be all about law, the jungle, and power. That is exactly what's been happening, in my view.
Can I say the thing that I always say?
You always say?
Stay tuned.
Stay tuned. You do always say that's true.
I do always say that.
Stay tuned with Preet.
Should call the show that.
Ian. Yeah.
Ian Bremmer, thanks as always. It's always a pleasure to have you on the show.
Good to see you, my friend.
And we'll talk soon. Thank you. Hey, Stay Tuned viewers. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode.